So misinformation would be the spread of information that is false or inaccurate, but without the intent of doing so. So people that maybe, I don't know, I can think of my grandmother, maybe she finds something funny or something scary and then she shares that online, but that happens to be false. Then disinformation is, on the other hand, the spread of false information, but with the intent to create chaos or confusion when some event happens.
Yeah. And how does that manifest in terms of technology? Are we talking about social media, regular, what do you call it, legacy media, or is it all of the above?
Yeah, I think misinformation, disinformation has always existed. If we look back in history across time, there's always been some people that have knowledge and they decide to shape it in a way to spread it to, let's say, the masses. I don't know, you can go to the Roman times and see Julius Caesar, the famous book, The Gallic Wars, and he, wrote it in a way that would help his own cause. So I think that we can trace this, let's say, spread in a very massive scale. If we look at the printing press in 1440 here in Germany, in Mainz, so not far from Berlin, there was this goldsmith named Johann Gutenberg, and he developed this printing press. And that enabled editors and people to spread information in a much faster way.
This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Steadman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
Doing great. Here at EIC 2025, Berlin, Germany, and just having a fantastic time. Did I mention how awesome of a job Marina has been doing, keeping things organized?
Yeah, she's walking across behind the cameras right now, but she's the MVP. As we've said, got a smile. That's something we'll take.
Martin, make sure you hear this message, right? Marina is kicking some butt.
Yeah, been a good show. We've got a guest with us that we're going, so another episode here from the stage of EIC. Introduce Alejandro Leal. He's the senior analyst with KuppingerCole. Welcome to the show, Alejandro.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Jim. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so thanks so much for taking the time. I know you're very busy. You've got like a bunch of different sessions, so definitely appreciate you taking that. But let's start with your background. How did you get into the identity space? Is it something that you chose, or did it choose you?
It chose me. I think, like many in the industry, it found me. I was mainly studying my bachelor's in international relations in Poland. And it was in my last semester when I had to write a paper on the impact of technology in international security. And that's when I became very interested in how technology impacts businesses, people, society, politics in general. And then I did a master's degree in Estonia on technology governance and digital transformation. And after that, I found this job at KuppingerCole, and here I am.
Well qualified for that, I would say.
Yeah,
I hope so.
Right.
So one of the topics that you talk a lot about is misinformation and disinformation. First, could you kind of define that for us? What is the difference?
Yes. I think it's important to distinguish these two. There's a lot of misconceptions out there, I think. So misinformation would be the spread of information that is false or inaccurate, but without the intent of doing so. So people that maybe, I don't know, I can think of my grandmother, maybe she finds something funny or something scary and then she shares that online, but that happens to be false. Then disinformation is, on the other hand, the spread of false information, but with the intent to create chaos or confusion when some event happens.
Yeah. And how does that manifest in terms of technology? Are we talking about social media, regular, what do you call it, legacy media, or is it all of the above?
Yeah, I think misinformation, disinformation has always existed. If we look back in history across time, there's always been some people that have knowledge and they decide to shape it in a way to spread it to, let's say, the masses. I don't know, you can go to the Roman times and see Julius Caesar, the famous book, The Gallic Wars, and he, wrote it in a way that would help his own cause. So I think that we can trace this, let's say, spread in a very massive scale. If we look at the printing press in 1440 here in Germany, in Mainz, so not far from Berlin, there was this goldsmith named Johann Gutenberg, and he developed this printing press. And that enabled editors and people to spread information in a much faster way. And that led to, in a long term, it led to the Reformation, it led to the religious conflicts in Europe, led to the 30 Years' War here in Germany. And that caused people to start, let's say, moving from speaking Latin to the vernacular. So in a way, it's a good thing because it democratizes the ability of people to communicate, to learn new things, to acquire knowledge. But I think that it can also have some consequences that people don't really plan ahead.
I think it's true for most technology, right?
Yes.
The intent was probably, maybe, hopefully, pure, and then gets corrupted, or look at other ways to use it. A hammer is a tool that can be used for any number of things. And I guess from a misinformation, disinformation, you mentioned that intent. That really is probably the key part. Is you're trying to further a goal with one, and the other one is a mistake of some sort or something on those lines. What can we actually do about it, though? How do we know if something is, misinformation versus disinformation? Because I feel like at this point, there's so much out there that's like, well, how do we believe and who do we believe in? With AI, what do we believe?
Yes.
Is that really Alejandro sitting there, or is it Alejandro's AI twin, right?
Yes.
Something like that. Like, what can we do about that?
Yeah, if we step back and look at this example that I mentioned of the printing press, I think back then there was a small number of people that could read and write. And for example, many people would print books on how to burn witches, for example. So that was clearly a intentional way of spreading ideas that maybe wasn't that nice. But it also led to the spread of religious texts or political texts or scientific texts that could be accessible for everyone in the population. But if we look at today, I think most people should know how to read and write. But it looks like all of the things that we see and read are getting more confusing, are getting more difficult to distinguish if they're true or they're not true. And maybe later we can talk about what are some of the potential solutions. But I think that the scale and the scope of misinformation and disinformation today is on another level.
I think those words are used to sometimes discredit ideas as well. So to say, oh yeah, I talked to Alejandro and he gave me all this misinformation or disinformation. I think sometimes those terms get loosely used, but the intent is so important because you use the example of your grandma saw some article maybe about a medicine and reposted it because she wants people to have all this good information, but if it's false, it's a kind of at least a disservice to everybody. But she didn't mean to harm people.
Yes, that's true. But I think that a few years ago, you could always provide this grandma example.
Yeah, all right.
Because for people like in the industry or younger people, it's easier to distinguish, okay, that's completely false. But that's getting more difficult today.
It's getting more difficult.
And it's going to keep getting more difficult in the future. And I think that with the use of generative AI, it's going to get even more complicated. My colleague, John Tolbert, which I think you guys know him very well, he recently shared with us a news article on some lawyers. I believe in the US, they shared a brief to the judge. They were looking at a case, and then the judge noticed that there were more than 30 mistakes, and they used ChatGPT to summarize the case.
Yeah, it created like fake
Yes.
cases and things like that.
It did.
Not a very well.
Yeah.
And John said LLMs do not care about the truth. It's text prediction. So
I kind of have a theory that the LLMs are too embarrassed to admit when they don't know something. They just make something up to not feel embarrassed.
yes.
Oh, that's why they have a
That's human
disclaimer.
emotion.
Every single LLM and interface to it says, use at your own risk.
Yeah,
right?
that's
They're
true.
washing their
Yes.
hands of any sort of responsibility that anything that puts out on it is accurate, right?
Yes.
Whether it's reporting or if you're trying to do something with AI voices, right? Like we did for April 1st episode. It's just use at your own risk.
Yes. Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about how did this start? Because I feel like personally, everything starts as misinformation until you can prove the intent is disinformation. How did things start, maybe before, and you kind of talked about, I think going back to Roman times, but how do we look at it now from a origination standpoint of where does misinformation start? And then when does it convert to disinformation? Does that make sense how I described that?
Yes. Yes. I think we need to look at where this information is flowing, and that's taking place in cyberspace. So in the digital landscape, in theory, we should all have an identity. That's why we're here at the IC. But in many cases, we see false information being spread, perhaps by a bot, perhaps by an anonymous account. And maybe people would share that because they may be in a sort of echo chamber where the thing that they read and see, it matches what they believe or what they are afraid of. So they might share that with the intention of spreading information and maybe telling their friends what's going on. And they don't really know the source of this information. But then we also see the other aspect, the other dimension, which is disinformation. And I think that the origin is very clear. It's with the intention of creating a narrative from a particular event or a situation. And as I said earlier, back then, a few years ago with the grandma example, it was easy to distinguish these things. But now with generative AI, I think from a business perspective, we need to be we need to understand this issue because there's been cases of false information affecting business practices, businesses that have been acquired or businesses that are talking to investors, and then there's some online narrative that is trying to affect such developments.
Yeah. I was thinking as you were talking earlier about two major scenarios, business and politics, right? And you see, I think misinformation can happen quite innocently where people hold a belief and they say that belief and, in some cases it's hard to tell what is true. Maybe there are some things that are factual, some things are opinion, and you can never prove an opinion wrong probably. But then also on the business side, just conversations that we have, I might have some beliefs that are incorrect, but if I knew that they were incorrect, I wouldn't repeat them. But on the disinformation side, from a business standpoint, I could potentially be saying, oh, that other software vendor, they're not good because of X, Y, and Z. And I know that's not true. Or I know that they are addressing it. Or I use some recent breach to say, oh, they were asleep at the wheel, knowing very well that maybe that could have happened to almost anybody. So that, I think, though, where we see it a lot also is in the political realm, where we hear with things like election interference, and maybe some countries trying to become involved in sway elections in other countries and things like that. But I also think we are more susceptible to disinformation in the political realm because people are becoming more and more ingrained into the political process and holding their beliefs more firmly than ever, I think. And they're more likely to believe disinformation if it, backs up what they already believe. If it aligns with what they believe, and if it doesn't, then they say, oh, disinformation.
Yes. Well, we were talking a little bit about philosophy earlier. I know this is an identity podcast, but if we look at the current narrative from a philosophical standpoint, it's this postmodern narrative that there are no truths, only interpretations. Of course, that's a very vague sentence because there are, of course, truths that we can see from a scientific point of view, etc. But I think many people, when I turned like 21, for example, I was like, okay, now I'm an adult. No more BS. Now it's time to behave like an adult. And then I started to see that political leaders or even business leaders, they sometimes spread information that it's not true, and they clearly don't have good intentions when doing this. So I think it ultimately comes to responsibility from the top level. And I know that we're all humans and we all have our own biases, we have our own preconditions. But I think if there's no responsibility from people on top, then this is going to create even more chaos and things are going to be more complicated. Not only politics, in sports. I was watching one game last night. My favorite team lost. I was very angry this morning, and I started to see comments from people from the other team, from the rival, saying all these things. And I'm like, no, that's not true. So, yeah, we can see that. You can
That's
talk
the place for disinformation is the comment section.
Yes. Sometimes it's a funny area, but you can see many comments that are just not factual.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of disinformation seems to be in the news cycle, right? And I guess, what is the transition of how this impacts identity?
Yeah, so there are many, I guess, potential solutions out there. But I think it ultimately comes down to identity, to digital identity, because as I said earlier, the spread of this information is taking place in cyberspace. And in theory, we should all have an identity if we want to post something on a social media platform. But then there's a problem that each social platform has different rules, different regulations. They have a different approach to how their social media works. So it's really difficult to keep track of who is who's saying what. But there's talk here in Europe. The Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, in January, he said that maybe Europeans can tie the European wallet with social media accounts. So you can always know who's saying what, and maybe that could prevent misinformation. But that also creates more problems with the social media platforms, and also when it comes to privacy, many citizens will be skeptical to that.
I also wonder, and I'd love to hear your feedback on this, whether or not the internet needs a anonymity feature. So let's say you're in a country and you are an oppressed group and you need to use the internet to get information out. But if the authorities maybe saw who was posting this, it could be bad news for you, right? So having anonymity in that context is a good thing.
Yes. I think that's kind of reminds me of a kind of like a clash between, do we want more privacy rights or do we want more truthful content?
Right.
Because I guess we can make things happen so the internet will be, having only truthful things, but how is that going to work?
Yeah, like philosophically, it's almost like the right to privacy and secrecy versus safety and security and surveillance and things like that.
Yes.
Well, even still, who decides what's true?
Yes, exactly.
That's also a big thing. Yeah, the arbiter of truth.
That's right. I volunteer as tribute. I will decide what is true.
Actually, I don't know if I'd want that job. Boy, oh boy, I don't know if I'd want that job.
I mean, I think it would be cool if some supranational organization like the UN could have some sort of platform where scientific and factual information is there and people maybe can access that somehow. But again, who's saying what's true in this world?
It seems like right now it's kind of the purview of the company that runs the platform, right? So like X or Facebook can decide whether or not to put a warning on a post that it hasn't been vetted, or, some other organization says this is not true, something like that, right? And is that the right place where it should be, or do you think that it should be in some kind of neutral third party's hands?
That's a good question. I'm not really sure. I think that, as I said earlier, I think it ultimately comes with to having responsibility. So the owners of these social media platforms should try to look at the impact of their technologies and see if there's anything they can do about it, because we are in a, let's say, capitalist system that is driven by profit, and then is that going to be beneficial for them in the long run if they change their whole dynamics within, or is that going to be good for people? So I think it really depends.
I think
I don't know how you see it.
The way I see it, I think it's as complex as the whole idea of decentralized identity and identity wallets. Because I think, so first to start with, I think that companies like X and Meta would love to hand this off to some third party and say, you deal with it and we don't have to worry about it.
I disagree.
Well, let me finish my thought. Okay. So I think they would love to get it off their plate because they've taken a lot of heat over it over the years. But I think that if we said there's going to be some arbiter of the truth and you had thrown out the UN, I can tell you right now, a lot of people in the United States would not trust what would come out of the UN. And I'm not giving my opinion on that one way or the other. But I can tell you, and the same, I think, if some arbiter was in the United States, folks in Europe would say, hey, can it be trusted? And so, and then that's not even taking the rest of the world into account, right? And so I think it ultimately does fall back on the platform that they have to do it. And they have to deal with this chaos right now of nobody's ever going to be happy with what they're doing, right? Or if somebody's happy, that means somebody else is not happy. What were you going to disagree with?
Yeah, so, I think you look at the business, right? You talked about the business model. If I am a social network, my entire business model is based on eyeballs looking at screens. I do not want people going away from my screen because that's how I'm going to serve up ads, engagement, right? Whatever we want to measure that for. So I would not want to hand off anything to do with my app or my service to a third party that could potentially draw people away from that. I want to own the entire experience. I'm saying that's good.
What if it was an API that somehow you pulled the info and then you presented the data?
We get into another scenario where it's, okay, well, do you trust that API or not? And 50% of the population is going to believe one thing. 50% of the population is going to believe the other. And this becomes a more of a question of, is there a difference between truth and fact?
Yes.
If we can't all agree that 2 + 2 = 4, now we're not even speaking the same language.
That's right.
Yes.
Right?
I think what you said about the business perspective is a sort of microcosm to what you were saying, Jim, on the, let's say, the US giving up their sovereignty to the UN or some other third party. I think that it's not only in the US, but I think everywhere in the world, people will be skeptical to give up that to some other organization that they don't have any accountability or transparency or any information on who are these people, what are they deciding. And that also has a dimension from a business perspective, how that's going to impact if you have a local business in the States or like anywhere in the world.
Mm-hmm. So I want to tie this back to digital identity because we are an identity practice. So we're getting philosophical, which is great. I think these are important matters to discuss because I think this ties well back to identity verification.
Yes.
What is a truth behind, or a fact maybe, behind, is this really Alejandro or someone pretending to be Alejandro or Jim or Jeff or whoever, right? What are the things that, from a misinformation standpoint, how does that tie back to establishing that verified credential or whatever it may be?
Yeah, I think there are several options on how to handle this. I think one would be, I guess, to label AI-generated content, but there's also some challenges there. I think the use of verifiable credentials could potentially be a good alternative. We still need to see, for example, here in Europe, there's still lots of developments around the eIDAS. All these 27, 28 countries have to agree. So we still don't really know the use cases and how it's going to look like. But I think there's potential there. But I think, as I said earlier, responsibility is key, because if a company is going to develop their own AI, Gen AI model, their own LLM, then they have to look at their data. It has to be, transparent. It has to be clean. They have to maybe implement RAG. There are many different ways that these LLMs can be trained, so the information that they're going to provide is not only going to be true, but also going to be useful for the business or for the customer that they're trying to target.
Yeah, it's a really interesting conundrum, because you could say, well, go to your AI and say, make me a picture of this political leader, make them 2 feet tall, right? And make their hair stick up and make it like 8 inches sticking up from their head.
Sounds like you're describing a troll doll.
Yeah, exactly what I was doing. But and put it on the end of a pencil.
Right.
Should the AI say, no, I can't do that because that's not what that person looks like? Or should the AI engine do that for you?
So is the AI an arbiter of truth?
Exactly. Or the company that makes the AI.
Right.
Like
Do they have to put enough guardrails on it? So where does that responsibility fall?
Yeah, but I think that could lead to more maybe fragmentation, different models having their own
Yes.
truth. Like DeepSeek, you ask them about Taiwan and Tiananmen Square, and then they're going to tell you something completely wrong.
Is it better to have more fragmentation, or do you want to see a finite number, maybe a half dozen AI models?
Well, who decides?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what do you think is better? What
Yeah.
do you think?
I don't know if I have an answer for it.
Yeah.
I don't know what is. It's moving too quickly, and I think we haven't agreed on what even the standard will be for that. I think MCP, Model Context Protocol, is certainly all the rage right now, and it's sorely needed. Right, it's been described as sort of the USB-C of that area, but I don't know who should be making those decisions.
Yeah, it's moving too fast, like you say, and regulators are not keeping track of what's happening. Many of them don't have technical knowledge, so it's sometimes hard for them to understand how these systems work. So yeah, I think more fragmentation could lead to more competition, but more chaos as well. But also, who decides that? So it's
Yeah, but so with the example I just painted, I thought of another thing, which was, let's say we wanted a political figure to look funny like that. Is that free speech or is that hate speech?
it
And
depends who you
that
ask.
depends on what your perspective is. It might be more dependent on where in the world you live and where
Yes.
you're from.
Yes.
But that's two ways to look at the exact same set of facts.
Well, if we live in a democratic society, I think that would be considered free speech. But at the same time, misinformation and disinformation are challenges to democratic systems.
Yeah. But I think in some countries, if you were to take that same model and say, take this religious figure and make them look ridiculous, print that picture, and now people start forwarding it on the internet, it's considered hate speech. And you can be arrested for it in some places.
Mhm. Yeah.
This is kind of a downer of an episode, man.
Hey, man, this is my kind of episode.
Like you're like all into this, yeah.
I'm loving it.
Yeah. I mean, I think the challenge, right, is I don't think we have the answers yet, right?
Yes.
We recognize the problem, or the beginnings maybe of the problem, because I'm sure we'll find new and creative ways to misuse anything. This is just the latest invention that we're grappling with. Okay, what do we do about this? I feel like there's a play here somewhere for authenticity. And maybe it's a digital watermark. Maybe it is something where, there is some sort of system to say, okay, if it was AI generated, make it very clear. And maybe that doesn't stand up in a court of law, or it's immediately flagged as, yeah, that's not real. But when you have technologies right now that are so good at making
Fakes.
Yeah, fakes, and they're hilarious. And I don't want to stifle the innovation because I can see a lot. I mean, we've used it for the podcast and stuff like that, but it is a problem. And so how do we, verify the authenticity of something is a really big part of this. And bringing it back to the identity side, it's the same thing, right?
Yes.
What we don't want to do is have a bunch of fake IDs and credentials that have proliferated. We were younger, right? You have fake ID, not saying that I did, but people would get a fake driver's license and someone that kind of looked like them, and that would pass to get them into the bar, right? To do whatever it may be. The same thing can happen also in the digital world is what happens if I replicate somebody's on-prem Active Directory account, and it looks and acts and behaves like a person, but it's not really them.
Yeah. I think I was thinking the most dangerous model is like some kind of disinformation that started World War III or something like that, right? So someone put out information that a nuclear kind of attack took place, and if you weren't able to authenticate that information was correct, maybe some country acts on that.
Yes.
That's the worst case scenario. But then I was thinking, you can then take it down several levels in terms of the global scale and say, hey, there's police officers going from door to door, but they're not really police officers, so protect yourself. And it's like fake. And then a police officer shows up at somebody's door and the person takes a negative action against that police officer thinking they're a fake person, right? And that could be a life or death event. So
And there's been cases like that of people committing crimes or other things to other people based on false information they found online. And I think another challenge, I know we're talking a lot about challenges, and I hope listeners
we shine a light on it. Not saying we know all the answers, but at least be aware of them.
Yes.
We can't fix what we don't know about.
Yes.
So let's know about it.
Another one would be that many of the conversations on digital identity, like here at EIC or all the conferences that we see in the States, it's taking place mainly in the Western world, and whatever comes out from these conversations affects the global South. And that's another area where many people don't really have a saying of how these technologies are going to impact not only their businesses, but their politics, their own echo chambers, etc. So I think it's also important to try to have that sort of, if we cannot have a UN implementing something, at least we can try to have a global conversation. I don't know how, but it's important to
keep it going.
Episodes like this, for example.
So now let's turn this into some action we can take. What do you recommend people do for themselves to not fall victim to mis and disinformation? And what can they recommend to people in their lives to, whether it's people that they're responsible for at work or family members, to protect themselves?
I think being responsible, what you're saying online is part of who you are in a way. You're sharing something about you, and many people don't see it that way. Many people see cyberspace, sure, as an extension of themselves, but they don't really understand that whatever you share online can have consequences. So responsibility would be one. Another one would be to have critical thinking. Sounds easy, sounds...
Yeah. Well, that's what I was saying, common sense, not so common sometimes.
Yes. So I don't know how it could lead in the next few years, maybe even having in schools critical thinking skills or lessons on how to distinguish false and truth in the online world. Sounds a little bit silly, the grammar example. It's easy to distinguish what's true or false, but imagine in 5, in 10 years, in 20 years.
In your own world, if you spot misinformation or disinformation in like our comments section, do you post something to call it out?
No, I don't.
You don't?
Do you?
Probably not.
Good counter.
No,
I'm curious.
I don't really go into social media other than LinkedIn. I think that would be
it's like the last safe place.
Yeah, it's like the last safe place. But there are times where I disagree with somebody, and I usually don't. I usually just say, okay, well,
don't feed the trolls.
Yeah,
I don't.
I guess if you distinguish, if is this disinformation, then there's really no reason to engage, because maybe it's a bot, maybe it's someone that has a narrative, and you're not going to change their mind.
Right.
You're just going to keep, making that the comment is going to be more visible. But if it's misinformation, if it's a friend or someone that you know, maybe you can have a civilized response.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to know if you ever had any, let's say, conversations in your comments on this podcast or some.
We've got pretty good fans. People who
good.
support us, I think, kind of get what we do. There's always going to be, I think, the threat of it. I deal with a lot of spam on our YouTube channel. You probably never see it, but a lot of them are seed values for Bitcoin wallets and things like that. They'd post into the comments and reject, not happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it does happen.
Yeah.
Now, is that disinformation? No, but it's clearly not information, and it's clearly not relevant or authentic to whatever it is they're posting on, right? I don't need 16 code words. But I was like, and it starts with, I liked your episode, and it just doesn't make any sense, right? So I think there's some of that. I think the other thing too is, I think there's a natural inclination where if it doesn't affect me, I'm less likely to do something about it. And I think that's just probably more, human part of it is, if someone went out there and said something bad about me or something about maybe the podcast, and we know it's not true, you and I would fight that.
That's different,
much more
yeah.
difficult.
That hasn't happened yet.
No, it hasn't yet. And nobody's called us on, even the best looking podcast.
I'll read articles sometimes where I'm like, oh, I want to say something, but I usually just restrain myself because I don't want to put negative energy into the world. Even if the article is negative energy, I usually just say to myself, I shouldn't have read that article. That just made me unhappy.
I think that requires courage because sometimes you really want to express something that sometimes could trigger you. But that's, again, what I said earlier, the responsibility part and the critical thinking, which are two human components. We can maybe talk about other technical solutions to this problem, but I think the human is the source of the whole conversation we're having today.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that was heavy, man.
That was heavy.
Let's try to lighten it up a little bit. You did mention philosophy, and you mentioned before we hit record, that you like to read. So I told you I was going to ask you, what's a good book or something that people in the identity space should read? And then I jokingly said something like The Art of War. And well, maybe. What's something that people should check out maybe in the book world that they can consume to maybe enlighten them from an identity standpoint, maybe their thoughts and viewpoints?
I think that there's an essay written by a German philosopher called The Question Concerning Technology. It was, I think, published in 1954 by a philosopher named Martin Heidegger. And he talks about that technology is not a means to an end. It's not an instrument, but it's a revelation of being. It's a revelation of what it means to be human. And he warns us that if we keep relying too much on this technological framework, we're going to start looking at the world through that lens, through that frame. And that could lead to, environmental catastrophes, etc. I know maybe that wasn't the most positive and happy.
Way to lighten it up. You sound like me. That's what I do every week.
There's a real chemistry happening here.
Yeah.
My wife
Andrew,
calls me
you and
a
I are
grandpa,
like-
so I guess, yeah.
Well, no, but I think it's important to recognize some of that stuff, right? I mean, maybe this episode is a little bit more of a downer, but it's mostly because this is a real challenge, right? I mean, there's plenty of things that we can talk through. Okay, like I said, we don't have all the answers, but at least we can shine a light on it and say, what are we going to do about this? Because we can't just bury our head in the sand and say, whatever, right? Whether it's, someone using credentials to do bad things, which still is the majority of attacks. There was our friend Jason Kinahan this morning from TELUS. He had a keynote, and over a third of all internet traffic is malicious bot activity. So whether you know it or not, it's happening. And whether you're doing something about just because you're not doing something about it doesn't mean it's stopping. And so it's just going to keep going. So I think it is important to have discussions like this. And
it's a wake-up call because, for example, this essay, if you read about it, then you could maybe have a different understanding of what technology is, and that could impact the way you conduct business or you do your IAM programs. You will think it's not just for technical efficiency, but we're talking about humans, we're talking about identities. So let's try to have a clear perspective and a nice framework that will work for the human.
I feel like there's a Black Mirror episode here that we can get into. I watched the newest season, the first episode on my way here. It's like, oh my gosh, I talked about like this whole AI and making an imprint of your brain, and you got to watch this because I don't know if you've seen it, but it got me thinking about like what that would be like in the future.
Hey, I'm almost through Better Call Saul.
Okay.
And everybody I tell who I'm watching it, they're like, oh,
it's so good.
Really good.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be ready to dive into something else.
Black Mirrors are great because they're like 45 minutes to an hour roughly, and they're all self-contained. So you can watch one and kind of be done with it. And you might want to be done with it because they're generally not happy stories.
Yes.
Right?
Okay.
But it's
like today's episode.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. But they are good and they're thought-provoking. Yes. And it's like, oh.
Exactly.
I hadn't thought about that before. And I think if that's what you take away from it, that's good, right? You're expanding your horizons, you're expanding it. So I'm going to ask you for the link that I can put in our show notes for that so people can check it out. Thank you so much for taking the time with us. Like I said, you have I was looking through your list, you have like 5 different panels and talks and things that you're doing.
Yeah,
so,
you're a busy guy.
Yeah, so taking the time out for this has been great.
Thank you for the invite. Happy to be here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead and wrap it up there for this episode. On behalf of Jim, thanks everybody for watching and or listening. Check us out on the web, idacpodcast.com. Like, subscribe, share. This is information, not we are information, definitely not disinformation, and we try to get it right.
We try not to have misinformation.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And if we are, call us on it. Let us know so we can fix it. Okay, that's it. Thanks, everyone. And we'll talk with everyone in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.